The winter that year did not arrive all at once. It crept in quietly, settling into the cracks of the town the way regret settles into a man's chest, slow, persistent, impossible to shake. Snow lay thin but stubborn along the outskirts, where the land stopped pretending to be generous and showed its true nature. That was where Eliza May Holloway worked, her boots sinking into half-frozen mud as she lifted a warped board from a heap no one else wanted. She moved with care, not because the boards were precious, but because her hands were. They were already split and swollen, knuckles raw beneath fingerless gloves, each breath fogging the air as if the cold were stealing words straight from her lungs. The shelter she was building leaned slightly to the east, as though it, too, was tired. Broken boards, mismatched nails, and hope that had learned to live on little. This was what she had to work with. And still she worked. The hammer rang out sharper than it should have in such a quiet place. Every strike seemed to announce her presence to the land, to the sky, to the town behind her that pretended not to see. She kept her eyes on the wood, on the grain running wild and uneven, because looking up meant remembering that people were watching even when they claimed they weren't. In a town like this, silence was never empty. It was crowded with judgment. Eliza had not always lived at the edge of things. Once, she had been folded into the middle, Sunday pews, shared meals, familiar laughter. That life unraveled without spectacle, the way cloth does when the thread has been weakening for years. Loss came, then rumor followed, and soon sympathy thinned into something colder. By the time winter arrived, the town had decided she was a story better told in whispers. So she stopped listening and started building. Each board she salvaged carried a history that was not hers. A fence post split by age, a crate lid once nailed shut around dry goods, a door that had failed to keep something out. She did not ask where they came from. She accepted what remained. Survival teaches a person which questions are unnecessary. The wind cut across the plain, tugging at her skirts, lifting loose strands of hair that had slipped free of her braid. She paused to steady a wall that refused to stand straight, pressing her shoulder against it, breath shallow with effort. For a moment, she closed her eyes. Not in prayer. She had learned better than that, but in calculation. How much light remained? How much strength? How much pride she could afford to spend before the day was done? From the low ridge beyond the frozen creek, Silas Boone reined in his horse. He had not intended to stop. The road past the town was one he'd ridden 100 times, usually with his thoughts fixed on fences that needed mending or cattle that wandered too far when the grass thinned. But something in the motion below, small, stubborn, solitary, had pulled his attention loose. He shaded his eyes and watched the woman at the edge of the land brace a wall with her body, as if daring the wind to push harder. Silas was a man known for keeping his distance. He spoke little, not out of secrecy but habit, and his ranch lay far enough out that folks often forgot him until they needed beef or lumber. He knew Eliza Holloway by reputation alone, the way most men did, through half-finished sentences and sideways glances in the mercantile. Seeing her now, bent beneath a sky that offered no mercy, those stories felt thin. He did not ride down. He did not call out. He stayed where he was, fingers loose on the reins, telling himself that observation was not involvement. The horse shifted beneath him, impatient, and after a long moment, Silas turned away. Some distances, he had learned, were easier to keep than to cross. Eliza drove another nail, then another. One bent and refused to straighten. She cursed under her breath, not at the nail, but at herself for letting the cold slow her hands. When she pulled the nail free, it tore skin with it, a thin line of red blooming bright against the gray of winter. She pressed her thumb into the wound until the sting dulled, then wiped her hand against her skirt and kept going. Blood could freeze. Walls could not. As afternoon leaned toward evening, the sky grew heavy, clouds thickening into a dull promise. Snow would come harder soon. She felt in her bones, the way a person feels bad news before it arrives. The shelter stood only half complete, gaps yawning between boards, the roof little more than an idea. She stepped back to look at it, chest tight, calculating again. What could be finished today? What would have to wait? Waiting in winter was a dangerous thing. She walked into town to trade a last coin for nails. The warmth inside the mercantile felt almost obscene, and she kept her coat buttoned as if to remind herself not to get comfortable. Conversations dipped when she entered, rose again once she passed. She caught fragments without meaning to, concern shaped like criticism, pity sharpened into blame. Someone said her name and laughed softly, as though it were already a cautionary tale. Outside, the wind had teeth. She pulled her coat tighter and started back toward the shelter, boots crunching over ground that was turning brittle with cold. She did not look toward the ridge. She had learned that hoping to be seen was a luxury she could not afford. Silas Boone did not see her in town, but he heard enough. The sheriff's voice carried through the open door of the saloon as Silas passed, low and firm, advising caution where Eliza Holloway was concerned. Best not to invite trouble. Best to let things settle as they would. Silas nodded as if he agreed, though something in his chest tightened in a way he did not like. By the time Eliza reached the shelter again, the light was thinning fast. She worked by feel more than sight, setting boards where she could, bracing what she must. When the wind shifted, it found a weakness and pushed hard. One of the walls shuddered, then gave, boards collapsing inward with a sound too final for comfort. Eliza stood still, hammer hanging useless at her side, watching the small progress of the day scatter at her feet. She knelt and began to stack the fallen boards again, slower now, not from defeat, but from exhaustion that had nowhere left to hide. Snow began to fall in earnest, soft at first, then steady, filling footprints, blurring edges. She set one board upright, then another, knowing it would not last the night, knowing she would try anyway. On the ridge, a lone rider had stopped once more, his horse facing the wind. Silas Boone watched the shelter sag, and the woman straightened beneath the falling snow. He did not tell himself stories about rescue or righteousness. He only felt, with a clarity that surprised him, that some things were wrong simply because they were allowed to continue. Eliza drove one last nail before her fingers refused to close around the hammer. She leaned her forehead against the cold wood, breath shuddering once before she mastered it. The shelter stood crooked and incomplete, but it stood. For now. She gathered her tools and stepped inside, sitting on the bare earth as snow whispered against the boards. The night closed in, and the wind carried with it the sound of hooves moving slowly away from the ridge, then stopping, as if the man riding them had not yet decided which direction he truly meant to go. Morning arrived the way mercy sometimes does, quietly, without asking permission. Eliza woke stiff and cold, her breath a pale cloud in the dim shelter. Snow had crept through the gaps overnight, dusting the floor and the single crate she used as a table. The walls still stood, though they leaned more than before, as if tired of holding themselves upright. She sat for a long moment, listening to the wind ease its grip, surprised she had been allowed another day. She pushed the door open and stopped. A wagon stood nearby, its wheels half buried in snow, the wood stacked neatly beneath a canvas cover. Clean boards, straight, new enough to still smell faintly of sap. Eliza's first thought was that the town had finally decided to make a show of charity. Her second was sharper, more defensive, that she would not accept it. Pride rose fast when a person has little else left to protect. Then she saw the man untying the canvas. Silas Boone moved with an economy that suggested he did not expect to be watched. He set the boards down one by one, stacking them carefully, as if each deserved respect. He did not smile when he noticed her standing there, nor did he look away. He tipped his hat once, a small acknowledgment, and returned to his work. "I didn't ask for help," Eliza said. The words came out steadier than she felt. "I know," Silas replied. His voice was low, unadorned. "That's why I brought boards, not questions." She studied him then, the frost in his beard, the way his hands moved without hurry, the space he left between them even now. Something in her wanted to argue, to insist on managing alone, but winter had taught her the cost of stubbornness. She nodded once and stepped aside. They worked without speaking. Silas measured, cut, and fitted as if the shelter were his own, while Eliza held boards in place, drove nails with renewed strength. The sound of building changed, less desperate now, more deliberate. When her hammer slipped, Silas steadied the wood, without comment. When his fingers stiffened in the cold, she set a cup of warmed water near him and looked away as he drank. The town noticed. By midday, figures appeared at a distance, pretending to pass by while watching the shelter rise straighter than before. Whispers traveled faster than the wind. Some were disapproving, others curious. No one interfered. The presence of Silas Boone carried a quiet authority, earned not through force but consistency. People trusted what endured. Snow fell again in the afternoon, heavier this time. The roof went on as the sky darkened, boards groaning under their own weight. Eliza climbed the ladder to secure the last plank, her balance uncertain. A sudden gust shoved hard against the unfinished side, and the ladder shifted. Her breath caught. Before fear could bloom, Silas's hands were there, firm, anchoring sure. "Easy," he said, not looking up. "I've got you." She believed him. The realization surprised her more than the storm. By the time darkness pressed in, the shelter stood whole. Not fine, not pretty, but solid enough to last a season. They stood together for a moment, snow gathering on their coats, the silence between them no longer sharp. "I'll leave the rest here," Silas said, gesturing to the remaining lumber, "in case the wind has other ideas." Eliza nodded. Words felt unnecessary, fragile things compared to what had already been done. She watched as he hitched his horse, movement slowed by fatigue. He did not bother to hide. When he mounted, she spoke before she could stop herself. "Thank you," she said. He met her eyes then, really met them, and something softened there. "You did the hard part," he replied. "You started." He rode away as the snow eased into a fine mist, the sound of hooves fading into the open land. Eliza stood alone again, but the loneliness had changed shape. Inside the shelter, she lit a lantern and set it near the small window, its glow steady and warm against the gathering dark. From the road, Silas glanced back once. The light was a small thing, easy to miss, but he saw it. He smiled to himself and rode on. Years later, when winters came and went as they always do, I would think of that light when the cold felt too close. Some kindnesses arrive without speeches. Some lives are rebuilt the same way, board by board, hand to hand, until standing becomes possible again. If this story warmed something in you, if it reminded you that quiet grace still exists, then stay with us. Subscribe to Wild West Tales and keep riding through these winters with us.